Could a single golden apple really spark the greatest war in human history? I mean, just picture a world where gods and mortals literally walk the same earth, where a single petty slight at a wedding escalates into a brutal, decade-long slaughter that wipes an entire, highly advanced civilization completely off the map. We're talking about tens of thousands of lives lost, massive fleets of ships darkening the horizon, and the burning of an absolutely impenetrable fortress. And supposedly, it all traces back to one piece of fruit?
Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to our explainer on the Trojan War, myth, reality, and the fall of a city. Today we're unpacking the legendary Bronze Age conflict between Mycenaean Greece and the Kingdom of Troy. This is a story that has completely gripped human imagination for over 3 millennia. It sits right at this fascinating intersection of ancient history, mythological propaganda, and sheer human hubris. We're going to look at the texts, the archaeology, and the legends to see exactly how a real destroyed city in Anatolia became the setting for antiquity's most famous epic.
Part 1. The Apple of Discord. Let's look at how this whole thing actually started.
So, the seeds of the Trojan War were actually planted at a divine wedding between King Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. They invited almost all the gods of the Greek pantheon to their party, but they made one catastrophic mistake. They deliberately left the goddess of discord, Eris, off the guest list. Well, she crashed the party anyway, and she brought a gift. She tossed a golden apple right into the middle of the guests, bearing 3 simple, devastating words: "To the fairest." That little inscription acted like a lit match in a powder keg. An immediate, incredibly high-stakes vanity war erupted between 3 of the most powerful goddesses in Olympus: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. Each claimed they were the rightful owner of the apple. They couldn't resolve it, so they demanded Zeus, the king of the gods, pick the winner.
To resolve the dispute, Zeus basically punted the decision onto a mortal. He chose a Trojan shepherd who, as it turns out, was actually a prince named Paris. Now, the goddesses didn't play fair at all. They immediately started offering him monumental bribes. Hera offered him dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered him supreme wisdom and guaranteed victory in war. But Aphrodite, she offered him something else entirely: the love of the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. Paris, completely driven by lust, went with Aphrodite's bribe. He awarded her the golden apple, earning the eternal hatred of Hera and Athena, and, without even realizing it, sealing the total destruction of his own city.
Part 2. Launching 1,000 ships. Here comes the Greek response.
Now, there was a pretty major catch to Aphrodite's promise. Helen was already married. She was the queen of Sparta, married to the fiercely powerful King Menelaus. So, when Paris traveled to Sparta and either abducted or eloped with her, sneaking her behind the massive walls of Troy, King Menelaus understandably didn't just send a strongly worded diplomatic message. He went straight to his brother, Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, and together they called upon all the kings and princes of Greece. They assembled a massive, completely unprecedented coalition force. We are talking about a fleet of more than 1,000 ships, loaded with legendary warriors like Odysseus, Nestor, and Ajax, crossing the Aegean Sea to lay siege to Troy. The Greeks were determined to get Helen back and punish the Trojans, no matter the cost.
But you have to remember, this wasn't just a mortal war. In the ancient Greek worldview, the gods were heavily invested in human affairs, and they treated the battlefield of Troy like a giant cosmic chessboard. Because Paris snubbed them, Athena and Hera passionately backed the Greeks, bringing Poseidon along for the ride. On the other side, Aphrodite naturally protected her champion Paris and the Trojans, and she rallied Apollo, Artemis, and Ares, the literal god of war, to her side. These gods actively interfered. They stepped onto the battlefield, healed their favorites, and manipulated events based on their own petty grievances, which made the war vastly more destructive than it would have been otherwise.
Part 3. 10 Years of Bloodshed. Let's look at the grueling reality of the siege.
So the Greeks arrive at the shores of Anatolia. They drag their ships onto the beach and they look up at the impenetrable walls of Troy. But what followed was absolutely not a swift victory. For 10 agonizing years, the conflict evolved into a brutal war of attrition. Now, most people just assume Homer's famous poem, the Iliad, covers this whole decade-long nightmare. But if we look at the timeline of the epic cycle, which is this vast collection of ancient poems, it absolutely doesn't. The poem called the Cypria covered the first 9 years. The Iliad actually only covers a tiny, specific slice of time, just 4 days and 2 nights in the 10th and final year of the siege. And honestly, it's not even really about the war as a whole. It's a hyper-focused narrative on the devastating, blinding rage of one specific Greek demigod.
And that brings us to the 2 legendary champions whose conflict defines the Iliad.
On the Greek side, you have Achilles. He's a near invulnerable demigod, driven by pure rage. Actually, he even stops fighting for his own side for a while just because he feels slighted by King Agamemnon. Then on the Trojan side, you have Prince Hector. Unlike Achilles, Hector is a mortal man, fighting not for personal glory, but out of a desperate, heartbreaking duty to defend his family and his doomed city. The epic reaches its climax when Hector kills Achilles' closest companion, Patroclus. In retaliation, Achilles completely loses it, returns to the battlefield, massacres the Trojan ranks, and brutally murders Hector, which pretty much signals the beginning of the end for Troy.
Part 4. The Wooden Horse. When brute force fails, you need a seriously deceptive trick. Because even with Hector dead, the Greeks still couldn't breach those massive walls. 10 years of brute force had totally failed, so the Greeks realized they needed to get creative. What followed, masterminded by the incredibly clever King Odysseus of Ithaca, is basically the greatest heist of antiquity. First, the Greeks build a massive hollow wooden horse, claiming it's an offering to the gods. Second, they hide their absolute best, most elite soldiers, including Odysseus himself, right inside its belly. Third, the rest of the Greek army burns their own camp and sails their fleet just out of sight, pretending they've finally given up and gone home for good. The Trojans are overjoyed, and they fall for the deception completely. They drag this massive horse right through their own impenetrable gates as a trophy of victory. That night, while the city sleeps off its massive celebrations, the soldiers quietly slip out of the horse, open the main gates for the returning Greek army, and they burn Troy to the ground.
Part 5. Myth, Reality, and Symbolism. Let's uncover the historical truth behind the legend.
It's an incredibly cinematic story, right? But it begs a massive question that historians and archaeologists have wrestled with for literally centuries. Did any of this actually happen? Well, for a long time, scholars thought Troy was just a fairy tale. But then, in 1868, archaeologists Heinrich Schliemann and Frank Calvert began excavating a mound at a site called Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey. And beneath the dirt, they didn't just find one city, they found layers of cities built right on top of each other. And exactly in the layer corresponding to the Late Bronze Age, around 1180 BC, they found evidence of a powerful, wealthy city that had been violently destroyed by fire and war. Troy, it turns out, was completely real.
So how do we reconcile those real, charred ruins with stories of gods and magical golden apples? The absolutely crucial point here is understanding oral tradition. For centuries before Homer ever even wrote the Iliad down, this story was passed entirely by word of mouth. Historians today believe there likely was a very real Trojan War. It was perhaps a conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and Trojans over control of highly lucrative trade routes, or, as some researchers suggest, a brutal war fought over access to crucial Black Sea copper shortages. But, as generations of bards retold the story around the fire, a localized trade dispute morphed into this massive romantic epic. Real kings became demigods. The motives shifted from pure economics to divine interference and heroic pride. It was essentially ancient propaganda, perfectly designed to make human conflict feel grand, heroic, and deeply meaningful.
Which leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought to chew on. Why does a 3,000-year-old story still captivate us so much today? Well, whether it was fought over copper reserves or a stolen queen, the core themes of Homer's epic, the blinding, destructive nature of pride, the devastating cost of revenge, the trickery we use to defeat our enemies, these are deeply, deeply embedded in human nature. The walls of Troy fell over 3,000 years ago, but the hubris of kings and the tragedy of war, those remain universally understood today. I highly recommend diving deeper into the source texts we covered in this explainer. It is incredibly eye-opening to see how the ancients wrestled with the exact same human flaws we face right now.